She's been a top-tier pro throughout all year long.
Hello, my dears. Thank you so very much for joining me today. So today we will continue our readings of the Witches and Fairy Doctors section within the book Irish Fairy and Folk Tales. Our first story for today is called The Horned Woman, and it is attributed to Lady Wilde. A rich woman sat up late one night, carding and preparing wool, while all the family and servants were asleep. Suddenly, a knock was given at the door, and a voice called, "Open, open." "Who is there?" said the woman of the house. "I am the witch of the one horn," was answered. The mistress, supposing that one of her neighbors had called and required assistance, opened the door, and a woman entered. Having in her hand a pair of wool carders, and bearing a horn on her forehead, as if growing there. She sat down by the fire in silence and began to card the wool with violent haste. Suddenly she paused and said aloud, "Where are the women? They delay too long." Then a second knock came to the door, and a voice called as before, "Open, open." The mistress felt herself constrained to rise and open to the call, and immediately a second witch entered, having 2 horns on her forehead, and in her hand a wheel for spinning wool. "Give me place," she said. "I am the witch of the 2 horns." And she began to spin as quick as lightning. And so the knocks went on, and the call was heard, and the witches entered, until at last 12 women sat round the fire, the first with 1 horn, and the last with 12 horns. And they carded the thread, and turned their spinning wheels, and wound and wove, all singing together in an ancient rhyme. But no word did they speak to the mistress of the house. Strange to hear, and frightful to look upon, were these 12 women, with their horns and their wheels, and the mistress felt near to death, and she tried to raise that she might call for help, but she could not move, nor could she utter a word or a cry, for the spell of the witches was upon her. Then one of them called to her in Irish, and said, "Rise, woman, and make us a cake." Then the mistress searched for a vessel to bring water from the well, that she might mix the meal and make the cake, but she could find none. And they said to her, "Take a sieve and bring water in it." And she took the sieve and went to the well, but the water poured from it, and she could fetch none for the cake. And she sat down by the well and wept. Then a voice came by her and said, "Take yellow clay and moss, and bind them together, and plaster the sieve so that it will hold." This she did, and the sieve held the water for the cake, and the voice said again, "Return, and when thou comest to the north angle of the house, cry aloud 3 times, and say, 'The mountain of the Fenian woman, and the sky over it, is all on fire.'" And so did she. When the witches inside heard the call, a great and terrible cry broke from their lips, and they rushed forth with wild lamentations and shrieks, and fled away to Slievenaman, or the mountains of the women, where was their chief abode. But the spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches if they returned again. And first, to break the spells, she sprinkled the water in which she was washed her child feet, the feet water, outside the door on the threshold. Secondly, she took the cake which the witches had made in her absence, of meal mixed with the blood drawn from the sleeping family, and she broke the cake into bits and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took the cloth they had woven and placed it half in and half out of the chest with the padlock. And lastly, she secured the door with a great crossbeam fastened in the jambs, so that none could enter. And having done these things, she waited. Not long were the witches in coming back, and they raged and called for vengeance. "Open, open," they screamed. "Open, feet water." "I cannot," said the feet water. "I am scattered on the ground, and my path is down to the low." "Open, open, wood and trees and the beam," they cried to the door. "I cannot," said the door, "for the beam is fixed in the jambs, and I have no power to move." "Open, open, cake that we made and mingled with blood," they cried again. "I cannot," said the cake, "for I am broken and bruised, and my blood is on the lips of the sleeping children." Then the witches rushed through the air with great cries, and fled back to Sylvanon, uttering strange curses on the spirit of the well, who had wished their ruin. But the woman and the house were left in peace, and a mantle dropped by one of the witches in her flight was kept hung up by the mistress as a sign of the night's awful contest. And this mantle was in possession of the same family for generation to generation for 500 years after. Our next story for today is called The Witch's Excursion, and it is attributed to Patrick Kennedy. Seamus Rua, or Red James, awakened from his sleep one night by noises in his kitchen. Stealing to the door, he saw half a dozen old women sitting round the fire, jesting and laughing. His old housekeeper, Madge, quite frisky and gay, helping her sister crones to cheering glasses of punch. He began to admire the impudence and imprudence of Madge, displayed in the invitation and the riot, but recoiled on the instant her officiousness in urging him to take a comfortable posset, which she had brought to his bedside just before he fell asleep. He had drunk it. he would have been just now deaf to the witch's glee. He heard and saw them drink his health in such a mocking style, and nearly to tempt him to charge them, besom in hand, but he restrained himself. The jug being emptied, one of them cried out, "Is it time to be gone?" And at the same moment, putting on a red cap, she added, "By Yarrow and Rue, and my red cap too, hie over to England." Making use of a twig which she held in her hand as a steed, she gracefully soared up the chimney, and was rapidly followed by the rest. But when it came to the housekeeper, Seamus imposed. "By your leave, ma'am," said he, snatching the twig and cap. "Ah, you distasteful old crocodile, if I find you here on my return, there'll be wigs on the green. By Yarrow and Rue, and my red cap too, hie over to England." The words were not out of his mouth when he was soaring above the ridge-pole and swiftly plowing through the air. He was careful to speak no word, being somewhat conversant with witch lore, as the result would be a tumble and the immediate return of the expedition. In a very short time they had crossed the Wicklow Hills, the Irish Sea, and the Welsh mountains, and were charging at whirlwind speed the hall door of a castle. Seamus, only for the company in which he found himself, would have cried out for pardon, expecting to be mummy against the hard oak door in a moment. But, all bewildered, he found himself passing through the keyhole, and along a passage, down a flight of steps, and through a cellar door keyhole, before he could form any clear idea of his situation. Walking to the full consciousness of his position, he found himself sitting on a stallion, plenty of lights glimmering round, and he and his companions, with full tumblers of frothing wine in hand, hobnobbing and drinking healths as joyfully and recklessly as if the liquor were honestly came by. And they were sitting in Seamus's old kitchen. The red beret or cap had assimilated Seamus's nature for the time being to that of his unholy companions. The heady liquor soon got into their brains, and a period of unconsciousness succeeded the ecstasy. The headache, the turning round of the barrels, and the scattered sight of poor Seamus. He woke up under the impression of being roughly seized and shaken and dragged upstairs and subjected to a disagreeable examination by the lord of the castle in his state parlor. There was much derision among the whole company gentle and simple. On hearing Seamus's explanation, and as the thing occurred in the Dark Ages, the unlucky Leinster man was sentenced to be hung as soon as the gallows could be prepared for such an occasion. The poor Hibernian was in the cart proceeding on his last journey, with a label on his back and another on his breast, announcing him as a remorseless villain, who for the last month had been draining the casks in my lord's vaults every night. He was surprised to hear himself addressed by his name, and in his native tongue, by an old woman in the crowd. "Ah, Seamus, Alana, is it going to die you are in a strange place without your red cap?" These words infused hope and courage into the poor victim's heart. He turned to the Lord and humbly asked leave to die in his red cap, which he supposed had dropped from his head in the vault. A servant was sent for the headpiece, and Seamus felt lively hope and warming his heart while placing it on his head. On the platform, he was graciously allowed to address his spectators, which he proceeded to do in the usual formula, composed for the benefit of flying stationers. "Good people all, a warning take by me." But when he finished the line, "My parents reared me tenderly," he unexpectedly added, "by Yarrow and Rue," and the disappointed spectators saw him shoot up obliquely through the air in the style of a sky-rocket that had missed its aim. It is said that the Lord took the circumstance much to heart, and never afterwards hung a man for 24 hours after his offense. Our next story today is called The Butter Mystery, attributed to Lady Wilde. There were two brothers who had a small farm and dairy between them, and they were honest and industrious, and worked hard to get along, though they barely had enough, after all their labor, just to keep body and soul together. One day while churning, the handle of the dash broke, and nothing being near to mend it, one of the brothers cut off a branch from an elder tree that grew close to the home, and tied it to the dash for a handle. Then the churning went on, but to their surprise, the butter gathered was so thick that all the cracks in the house were soon full, and still there was more left. The same thing went on every churning day, so the brothers became rich, for they could fill the market with their butter, and still had more than enough for every buyer. At last, being honest and true men, they began to fear that there was witchcraft in it, and that they were wronging their neighbors by abstracting their butter. and bringing it to their own churn in some strange way. So they both went off together to a great fairy doctor and told him the whole story and asked him for his advice. "Foolish men," he said to them, "why did you come to me? For now you have broken the spell, and you will never have your crocks filled with butter any more. Your good fortune has passed away. For know the truth now. You were not wrongdoing your neighbors. All was fair and just that you did, but this is how it happened. Long ago, the fairies passing through your land had a dispute and fought a battle, and having no arms, they flung lumps of butter at each other, which got logged into the branches of the elder tree in great quantities. For it was just after May Eve, when the butter was plenty. This is the butter you have, for the elder tree has a sacred power which to preserve it until now, and it came down to you through the branch you cut for a handle on the dash. But the spell is broken now that you have uttered the mystery, and you will have no more butter from the elder tree." Then the brothers went away sorrowful, and never after did the butter come beyond the usual quantity. However, they had already made so much money that they were content, and they stocked their farm, and all things prospered with them, for they had dealt uprightly in the matter, and the blessings of the Lord were on them. The Confessions of Tom Burke, attributed to T. Crofton Crocker. Tom Burke lives in a low, long farmhouse, resembling in outward appearance a large barn, placed at the bottom of the hill, just where the new road strikes off from the old one, leading from the town of Kilworth to that of Lismore. He is of a class of persons who were a sort of black swans in Ireland. He is a wealthy farmer. Tom's father had, in good old times, when £100 were no inconsiderable treasure, either to lend or spend, accommodated his landlord with the sum, at interest, and obtained as return for his civility a long lease, about half a dozen times more valuable than the loan which procured it. The old man died worth several £100, the greater part of which, with his farm, he bequeathed to his son, Tom. But besides all this, Tom received from his father, upon his deathbed, another gift, far more valuable than worldly riches, greatly as he prized and is still known to prize them. He was invested with the privilege, enjoyed by few of the sons of men, of communicating with those mysterious beings called the good people. Tom Burke was a little, stout, healthy, and active man, about 55 years of age. His hair is perfectly white, short and bushy behind, but rising in front, erect and thick above his forehead, like a new clothes brush. His eyes are of that which I have been observed with persons of a quick but limited intelligence. They are small, gray, and lively. The large and projecting eyebrows under, or rather within, which they twinkle, giving them an expression of shrewd intelligence, if not cunning. And this is very much the character of the man. If you want to make a bargain with Tom Burke, you must act as if you were a general besieging a town, and make your advances a long time before you can hope to obtain possession. For if you march up boldly and tell him at once your object, you are for the most part sure to have the gates closed in on your teeth. Tom does not wish to part with what you wish to obtain. Or another person has been speaking to him for the whole of the last week. Or it may be your proposal seems to meet the most favorable reception. Very well, sir. That's true, sir. I'm very thankful to your honor, and other expressions of kindness and confidence greet you in reply to every sentence. And you part from him wondering how he can have obtained the character which he universally bears, of being a man whom no one can make anything of in a bargain. But when you next meet him, the flattering illusion is dissolved. You find you are a great deal further from your object than you were when you thought you had almost succeeded. His eye and his tongue express a total forgetfulness of the mind which never lost sight for an instant. And you have to begin operations afresh, with the disadvantage of having put your adversary completely upon his guard. Yet, although Tom Burke is, whether from supernatural foretellings, or, as many will think more probable, from the tell-true experience, so distrustful of mankind, and so close in his dealings with them, he is no misanthrope. No man loves better the pleasures of a genial board. The love of money, indeed, which is with him, and who could blame him? A very ruling propensity, and the gratification which it has received from the habits of industry, sustained throughout a long, pretty, and successful life, have taught him the value of sobriety, during those sessions at least when a man's business requires him to keep possession of his senses. He has therefore A general rule never to get drunk but on Sundays. But in order that it should be a general one to all intents and purposes, he makes a method which, according to better logicians than he is, always proves the rule. He has many expectations. Among those, of course, are the evenings of all fair and market days that happen within his neighborhood. So all the days in which funerals, marriages, and christenings take place among his friends, within many miles of him. As to this last class of expectations and exceptions, it may, at first, very singular, that he is much more punctual in his attendance at the funerals than at all the baptisms and weddings of his friends. This may be construed as an instance of disinterested affection for the departed worth, very uncommon in this selfish world. But I am afraid that the motives which lead Tom Burke to pay more court to the dead than the living are precisely those which lead to the opposite conduct for the generality of mankind. A hope of future benefit, and those a fear of future evil. For the good people, who are a race as powerful as they are capricious, have their favorites among those who inhabit this world. Often they show their affections by easing the objects of it from the load of its burden, of this burdensome life, and frequently reward or punish the living according to the decree of reverence paid to the obsequies and the memory of the elected dead. Some may attribute to the same cause and apparently humane and charitable actions of which Tom, and indeed other members of his family, are known frequent to perform. A beggar had seldom left their yard farm with an empty wallet, or without obtaining a night's lodging, if required, with sufficiency of potatoes and milk to satisfy even an Irish beggar's appetite, an appeasing which account must usually be taken of the auxiliary jaws of a hungry dog, and of 2 or 3 still more hungry children, who line themselves well within to atone for their nakedness throughout. If one of the neighboring poor be seized with the fever, Tom will often supply the sick wretch with some untenanted hut upon which one of his 2 large farms, for he had added one to his patrimony, or will send his laborers to construct a shed at the headside, and supply straw for a bed while the disorder continues. His wife, remarkable for the largeness of her dairy and the goodness of everything it contains, will furnish milk for whey, and their good offices are frequently extended to the family of the patient, who are perhaps reduced to the extremity of wretchedness by even the temporary suspension of a father or husband's labor. If much of this arises from the hopes and fears to which I have alluded, I believe much of it flows from a mingled sense of compassion and duty, which is sometimes seen to break from an Irish peasant's heart, even where it happens to be enveloped in a habitual covering of advice and fraud, and which I once heard speak in terms not to be misunderstood. When we get a deal, 'tis only fair we should give back a little of it. It is not easy to prevail on Toms to speak to those of the good people, with whom he is said to hold frequent and intimate conversations. To the faithful who believe in their power, and their occasional delegation of it to him, he seldom refuses, if properly asked, to exercise his high prerogative when any unfortunate being is struck in his neighborhood. Still, he will not be won unissued. He is the first difficult of persuasion, and must be overcome by a little gentle violence. On these occasions he is unusually solemn and mysterious, and if one word of reward be mentioned, he at once abandons the unhappy patient, such a proposition being a direct insult to his supernatural superiors. It is true that, as the laborer is worthy of his hire, most persons gifted as he is do not scruple to receive a token of gratitude from the patients or their friends after their recovery. It is recorded that a very handsome gratuity was once given to a female practitioner of this occult science, who deserves to be mentioned not only because she was a neighbor and a rival of Tom's, but from the singularity of a mother deriving her name from her son. Her son's name was Owen, and she was always called Owen Sauveur, or Owen's mother. This person was, on the occasion to which I have alluded, persuaded to give her assistance to a young girl who had lost the use of her right leg. Owen's mother found the cure to be a difficult one. A journey of about 18 miles was essential for the purpose, probably to visit one of the good people who resided at the distance, and this journey could only be performed by Owen's mother, traveling upon the back of a white hen. The visit, however, was accomplished, and at a particular hour, according to the prediction of the journey's end. According to the prediction of this extraordinary woman, when the hen and her rider were to reach their journey's end, the patient was seized with an irresistible desire to dance, which she gratified with the most perfect freedom of the diseased leg, much to the joy of her anxious family. The gratuity in this case was, as it surely ought to have been, unusually large, for the difficulty of procuring a hen willing to go so long a journey with such a rider. To do Tom Burke justice, he is on these occasions, as I have heard from many competent authorities, perfectly disinterested. Not many months since he recovered a young woman, a sister of a tradesman living near him, who had been struck speechless after returning home from a funeral, and had continued so for several days. He steadfastly refused receiving any compensation, saying that even if he had not as much as he would buy him his supper, he would take nothing on this case, because the girl had offended at the funeral of one of the good people belonging to his family, and though he would do her a kindness, he would take none from her. Thank you for the follow, CNR2K. About this time, the last remarkable affair took place. My friend, Mr. Martin, who is a neighbor of Tom's, had some business to transact with him, which it was exceedingly difficult to bring to a conclusion. At last Mr. Martin, having tried all quiet means, had recourse to a legal process which brought Tom to reason, and the matter was arranged to their mutual satisfaction, and with perfect good humor between the parties. The accommodation took place after the dinner at Mr. Martin's house, and he invited Tom to walk into the parlor to take a glass of punch, made of some excellent poteen, which was on the table. He had long wished to draw out his highly endowed neighbor on the subject of his supernatural powers, and as Mrs. Martin, who was in the room, was rather a favorite of Tom's, this seemed a good opportunity. I am well, CNR 2K. Well, Tom, said Mr. Martin, this was a curious business of Molly Dwyer's, who recovered her speech so suddenly the other day. You may say that, sir, replied Tom Burke, but I had to travel far for it. No matter for that now. Your health, ma'am, said he, turning to Mrs. Martin. Thank you, Tom, but I am told you had some trouble once in the way in your own family, said Mrs. Martin. So I had, ma'am. Trouble enough. But you were only a child upon that time. Come, Tom, said the hospitable Mr. Martin, interrupting him, take another tumbler. And when he then added, I wish you would tell us something of the manner in which so many of your children died. I am told they dropped off, one after the other, by some disorder, and that your eldest son was cured in the most extraordinary way. When the physicians had given him over, "'Tis true for you, sir," returned Tom. "Your father, the doctor, God be good to him, I won't belie him in his grave, told me when my fourth boy was a week sick that himself and Dr. Barry did all a man could do for him, but that they could not keep him from going after the rest. No more they could if the people that took away the rest wished to take him too. But they left him, and sorry to the heart I am. I did not know before why they were taking my boys from me. If I did, I would not be left trusting of the two of them now." "And how did you find it out, Tom?" inquired Mr. Martin. "Why then, I'll tell you, sir," said Burke. "When your father said what I told you, I did not know very well what to do. I walked down to the little green lane, you know, sir, that goes to the riverside near Dick Hefty's ground, for 'twas a lonesome place, and I wanted to think of myself. I was heavy, sir, and my heart got weak in me when I thought I was going to lose my little boy. I did not know well how to face his mother with the news, for she doted down upon him. Besides, she never got the better of all she cried at his brother's burying the week before. As I was going down to the boreen, I met an old Baku that used to come about the place once or twice a year, and used always to sleep in our barn while he stayed in the neighborhood. So he asked me how I was. 'Bad enough, Seamus,' says I. 'I'm sorry for your trouble,' says he. 'But you're a foolish man, Mr. Burke. Your son would be well enough if you would only do what you ought with him.' 'What more can I do with him, Seamus?' says I. 'The doctors gave him the once-over.' 'The doctors know no more what ails him than they do what ails a cow when she stops her milk,' says Seamus. 'But go to such a one, telling me his name, and try what he'll say to you.'" "And who was that Tom?" asked Mr. Martin. "I could not tell you that, sir," said Burke, with a mysterious look. "Howsomever, you often saw him, and he does not live far from this. But I had a trial of him before, and if I went to him first, maybe I'd have now some of them that's gone. And so Seamus so often told me. Well, sir, I went to this man, and he came with me to my house. Of course, I did everything he bid me. According to his order, I took the little boy out of the dwelling house immediately, sick as he was, and made a bed for him and myself in the cow house. Well, sir, I lay down by his side in the bed, between two of the cows, and he fell asleep. He got into a perspiration, saving your presence, as if he was drawn through the river, and breathed hard, and a great impression on his chest, and was very bad entirely through the night. I thought about 12 o'clock he was going at last, and I was just getting up to go call the man I told you of, but there was no occasion. My friends were getting the better of them that wanted to take him away from me. There was nobody in the cow house but the child and myself. There was only one halfpenny candle lighting it, and that was stuck in the wall at the far end of the house. I had just enough light of where we could see lying a person walking or standing near us. And there were no more noise than if it were a churchyard, except the cows chewing the fodder in the stalls. Just as I was thinking of getting up, as I told you, you won't believe my father, sir. He was a good father to me. I saw him standing at the bedside, holding out his right hand to me, and leaning his other on the stick he used to carry when he was alive, and looking pleasant and smiling at me, all as if he was telling me not to be afeared, for I would not lose the child. "Is that you, father?" says I. He said nothing. "If that's you," said I again, "for the love of them that is gone, let me catch your hand." And so he did, sir, and his hand was as soft as a child's. He stayed about as long as you'd be going from this gate to below at the end of the avenue, and then he went away. In less than a week the child was as well as if nothing ever ailed him, and there isn't tonight a healthier boy of 19. From this blessed house to the town of Ballyporeen, across the Kilworth Mountains. "But I think, Tom," said Mr. Martin, "it appears as if you are more indebted to your father than to the men recommended to you by Seamus. Or do you suppose it was he who made favor with your enemies among the good people, and that you then your father—" "I beg your pardon, sir," said Burke, interrupting him, "but don't call them my enemies. 'Twas not be wishing me for a good deal to sit by when they are so called. No offense to you, sir. Here's wishing you a good health and long life. I assure you, returned Mr. Martin, I meant no offense. Tom, but was it not as I say? I can't tell you that, sir, said Burke. I'm bound down, sir. Howsoever, you may be sure the man I spoke of, and my father, and those they know, settled it between them. There was a pause, of which Mrs. Martin took advantage to inquire of Tom whether something remarkable had not happened about a goat and a pair of pigeons at the time of his son's illness, circumstances often mysteriously hinted at by Tom. See that now, said he, turning to Mr. Martin. How well she remembers it. True for you, ma'am, the goat I gave the mistress, your mother, when the doctors ordered her goat's whey. Mrs. Martin nodded assent, and Tom Burke continued, Why then, I'll tell you how that was. The goat was as well as ever a goat ever was. For a month after she was sent to Killen, to your father's. The morning after the night I just told you of, before the child woke, his mother was standing at the gap leading out to the barnyard, into the road, and she saw 2 pigeons flying from the town of Kilworth off the church down towards her. Well, they never stopped, you see, till they came to the house on the hill at the other side of the river, facing our farm. They pitched upon the chimney of that house, and after looking about them for a minute or 2, they flew straight across the river, and stopped on the ridge of the cow-house where the child and I were laying. Do you think they came here for nothing, sir? Certainly not, returned Mr. Martin. Well, the woman came in to me frightened, and she told me. She began to cry. Whilst you, fool, says I, 'tis all for the better. 'Twas true for me. What do you think, ma'am? The goat that I gave your mother, that was seen feeding at sunrise that morning by John Jack Cronin, as merry as a bee, at that very moment, dropped down dead without anyone knowing why, before Jack's face, and at the very moment he saw 2 pigeons from the top of the house out of the town towards the Lismire road. 'Twas at the same time my woman saw them, just as I had told you. 'Twas very strange indeed, Tom, said Mr. Martin. I wished you could give us some explanation of it. I wish I could, sir, was Tom Burke's answer, but I am bound down. I can't tell but what I'm allowed to tell, any more than a century is left walk more than his rounds. I think you said something of having some former knowledge of the man that assisted you to cure your son, said Mr. Martin. So I had, sir, said Burke. I had a trial of that man. But that's neither here nor there. I can't tell you anything about that, sir. But would you like to know how he got his skill? Oh, very much indeed, said Mr. Martin. But you can tell us his Christian name, that we may know him better throughout the story, added Mrs. Martin. Tom Burke paused for a moment to consider this proposition. Well, I believe that I may tell you anyhow. His name is Patrick. He was always a smart, acute boy, and would be a great clerk if he stuck to it. The first time I knew him, sir, was at my mother's wake. I was in great trouble, for I did not know where to bury her. Her people and my father's people, I mean their friends, sir, among the good people, had the greatest battle that was known for many a year at Dunmanway Cross, to see to whose churchyard she'd be taken. They fought for 3 nights, one after another, without being able to settle it. The neighbors wondered how long I was before I buried my mother, but I had my reasons, though I could not tell them at the time. Well, sir, to make my story short, Patrick came on the 4th morning and told me that he had settled the business. And that day we buried her in Kilcrumper churchyard with my father's people. He was a valuable friend, Tom, said Mrs. Martin, with difficulty suppressing a smile. But you were about to tell us how he became so skillful. So I will, and welcome, replied Burke. Your health, ma'am. I'm drinking too much of this punch. But to tell the truth, I never tasted the likes of it. It goes down one's throat like sweet oil. But what was I going to say? Yes, well, Patrick, many a long year ago, was coming home from a bairn late in the evening, and walking by the side of a river opposite of the Big Inch, a low meadow ground near a river, near FaeWorks. He had taken a drop, to be sure, and he was a little merry, as you may say, and knew very well what he was doing. The moon was shining, for it was the month of August, and the river was as smooth and as bright as a looking-glass. He heard nothing for a long time but the fall of water at the mill, where down about a mile the river, and now and then the crying of the lambs on the other side of the river. All at once there was a noise of a great number of people laughing, as if they'd break their hearts, and of a piper playing amongst them. It came from the Inch at the other side of the ford, and he saw through the mist that hung over the river, a whole crowd of people dancing on the inch. Patrick was as ever fond of a dance as he was of a glass. That's saying enough for him. So he whipped off his shoes and his stockings and made way with him across the ford. After putting on his shoes and stockings on the other side of the river, he walked over to the crowd and mingled with them for some time without being minded, for he was very proud of. He thought, sir, that he'd show them better dancing than any of them themselves. And a good right he had. But, his dancing was no more to theirs than mine would be to the mistresses there. They did not seem as if they had a bone in their bodies, and they kept it up as if nothing could tire them. Patrick was ashamed of himself. For he thought he had not his fellow in all the country round, and was going away, when a little old man that was looking at the company bitterly, as if he did not like what was going on, came up to him. "Patrick," says he. Patrick started, for he did not think anyone there knew him. "Patrick," says he, "you're discouraged, and no wonder for you. But you have a friend near you. I'm your friend, and your father's friend, and I think worse, more, of your little finger than I do of all that's going on here, though they think no one is as good as themselves. Go into the ring and call for a lilt. Don't be afeard. I tell you the best of them did not do it as well as you shall, if you will do as I bid you." Patrick felt something within him, as if he ought not to gainsay the old man. He went into the ring and called the piper to play the best double he had. And sure enough, all that the others were able for were nothing to him. He bounded like an eel, now here and now there, as light as a feather. Although the people could hear the music answered by his steps, the beat time to every turn of it, like the left foot of the piper. He first danced a hornpipe on the ground, then they got a table, and he danced a treble on it that drew down shouts from the whole company. At last he called for a tincture, and when they saw him, all as if he was spinning on it like a top, they did not know what to make of him. Some praised him for the best dancer that ever entered a ring. Others hated him because he was better than themselves, although they had a good right to think themselves better than him or any other man that ever went the long journey. And what was the cause of his great success? Inquired Mrs. Martin. He could not help it, sir, replied Tom Burke, that they that could make him do more than that made him do. Howsomever, when he had done, they wanted them to dance again. But he was tired, and they could not persuade him. At last he got angry and swore a big oath, saving your presence, that he would not dance a step more, and the word was hardly out of his mouth when he found himself all alone, with nothing but a white cow grazing by his side. Did he ever discover why he was gifted with these extraordinary powers in the dance, Tom? Asked Mr. Martin. I'll tell you that too, sir, answered Bork, when I come to it. When he went home, sir, he was taken with a shivering, and went to bed. And when the next day they found he had got a fever, or something like it, for he raved as if he was mad. They couldn't make out what he was saying, though he talked constant. The doctors gave him the over, but it's little they knew what ailed him. When he was, as you may say, about 10 days sick, and everybody thought that he was going, one of the neighbors came in with him with a friend of his from Ballinlacken, that was keeping with him some time before. I can't tell you his name either, only it was Darby. The minute Darby saw Patrick, he took a little bottle with the juice of herbs in it out of his pocket and gave Patrick a drink of it. He did the same every day for about 3 weeks. And then Patrick was able to walk again, as stout and as hearty as ever he was in his life. But he was a long time to come before he came to himself, and he used to walk the whole day sometimes by the ditch side, talking to himself, like as if there was someone along with him. And so there was, surely, or he wouldn't be the man that he was today. I suppose it was from such companion that he learned his skill, said Mr. Martin. You'll have it all now, sir, replied Burke. Darby told him his friends were satisfied with what he did the night of the dance, and though they couldn't hinder the fever, they'd bring him over it, and teach him more than many knew beside him. And so they did, for you see, all the people he met on that inch were friends of a different faction. Only the old man that spoke to him was a friend of Patrick's family, and it went again his heart, you see, that the others were so light and active, and he was bitter in himself to hear about them boasting how they dance with any set in the whole country round. So he gave Patrick the gift that night, and afterwards gave him the skill that makes him the wonder of all that know him. And to be sure, it was only after learning he was at the time when he was wandering in his mind after the fever. I have heard many strange stories about that inch near Ballyhefan ford, said Mr. Martin. 'Tis a great place for the good people, isn't it, Tom? You may say that, sir, replied Burke. I could tell you a great deal about it. Many a time I sat as good as 2 hours by the moonlight, and the other side of the river, looking at them playing goal, as if they'd break their hearts over it, with their coats and waistcoats off, and white handkerchiefs on the heads of one party, and red ones on the other, just as you'd see on Sunday in Mr. Simmons' big field. I saw 'em one night play till the moon set, without one party being able to take the ball from the other. I'm sure they were going to fight, only 'twas near morning. I told your grandfather, ma'am, used to see 'em there too, said Burke, turning to Mrs. Martin. So I have been told, Tom, replied Mrs. Martin. But don't they say that the churchyard of Kilcrumper is just as favourite a place with the good people as the Ballyhefan Inch? Why then, you never heard, ma'am, what happened to Davy Rock in that same churchyard? Said Burke, turning to Mr. Martin, added, "'Twas a long time before he went into your service, sir. He was walking home of the evening from the fair of Kilcummer, and a little merry to be sure after the day, when he came up with the bairn. So he walked along it, and thought it very queer that he did not know a mother's soul in the crowd but one man. And he was sure that man was dead many years before. Howsomever, he went on with the bairn till they came to the Kilcrumper churchyard, and faith, he went in and stayed with the rest, to see the corpse buried. As soon as the grave was covered, what should they do but gather about a piper that came along with them, and fall to dancing as if it was a wedding. Davy longed to be among 'em, for he hadn't a bad foot of his own at the time, whatever he may now. But he was loth to begin, because they all seemed strange to him, only the man I told you that he thought was dead. Well, at last this man saw what Davy wanted, and came up to him. "Davy," says he, "take out a partner, and show what you can do, but take care, and don't offer to kiss her." "That I won't," says Davy, although her lips were made of honey. And with that he made his bow to the prettiest girl in the ring, and he and she began to dance. 'Twas a jig they danced, and they did it to the whole admiration, do you see, of all that were there. 'Twas all very well till the jig was over, and just as they had done, Davy, for he had a drop in himself, and was as warm with the dancing, forgot himself, and kissed his partner according to the custom. The smack was no sooner off his lips, you see, than he was alone in the churchyard, without a creature near him, and all he could see was the tall tombstones. Davy said they seemed as if they were dancing too, but I suppose that was only the wonder of what happened to him, and he being a little in the drink. Howsomever, he found it was a great many hours later than he thought it was. 'Twas near morning when he came home, but they couldn't get a word out of him till the next day, when he woke out of a dead sleep about 12 o'clock. When Tom had finished the account of Davy Rock and the bairn, it became quite evident that the spirits, of some sort, were working too strong within him to admit of his telling many more tales of the good people. Tom seemed conscious of this. He muttered a few minutes' broken sentences concerning churchyards, riversides, leprechaun, and the good people, which were quite unintelligible, perhaps, to himself, and certainly to Mr. Martin and his lady. At length he made a slight motion of the head upwards, as if to say, "I can talk no more," and stretched his arm on the table, upon which he placed the empty tumbler. Slowly, and with the most knowing and cautious air, and rising from his chair, walked, or rather rolled, out of the parlor door. He turned round to face his host and hostess, but after various ineffectual attempts to bid them good night, the words as they rose always being choked by a violent hiccup, while the door, which he held by the handle, swung to and fro, carrying his unyielding body with it. He was obliged to apart in silence. The cowboy, sent by Tom's wife, who knew well what sort of allurement detained him when he remained out after a certain hour, was in attendance to conduct his master home. I have no doubt that he returned without meeting any material injury, as I know that within the last month he was, to his own words, as stout and hearty a man as any of his age in the country Cork. And with that, my dears, was the final story and concluding our reading hour. The last one was quite a lengthy one, it seems like. But I do thank you all so much for joining me today. I do hope that this little moment of time was able to soothe and bring you some comfort and wonder with the stories I tell you today. But until we next meet, my dears, ta-ta, and fare thee well. thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you like what you saw here, I ask that you leave a like, comment, subscribe, and until we next meet, my dears, I do hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And until then, ta-ta and farewell.